Rain mixed with spilled diesel paint's rainbow slicks on the fractured asphalt. Three men in heavy leather patches soaked through step into a shadowed alley reeking of sour beer and rot. They aren't looking for redemption. They're just looking for a dark corner to take a leak. But beneath the hum of their idling Harley-Davidsons, a sharp, ragged sound cuts through the damp night, a wet whimper from a rusted dumpster. What they find will rewrite their brutal lives, and 15 years later, unearth a truth none of them saw coming. Grease-stale sweat and the sharp metallic tang of cold rain clung to Rust. His knuckles throbbed. 2 hours ago, he had been using them to shatter the jaw of a rival at a dive bar across the county line. Now he just wanted a cigarette, a piss, and the oblivion of his own mattress. He kicked the kickstand down. His boots scraped against the loose gravel of the alleyway behind an abandoned meatpacking plant. Beside him, the heavy V-twin engines of Wyatt and Cole's bikes choked into a rumbling, idle, coughing, thick white exhaust into the freezing November air. "Make it quick," Rust muttered, his voice a gravelly scrape against the quiet. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into a puddle. "My clutch hand is freezing up." Cole didn't answer. He was already unzipping his jeans against the rusted corrugated metal of the building. Wyatt leaned against his handlebars, lighting a crumpled Marlboro, the brief flare of the Zippo illuminating the deep lines carved into his 30-year-old face. They were Hell's Angels, men built out of bad choices, loud machinery, and a rigid, violent brotherhood. There was no softness here, only leather denim and the cold metal of the .45 tucked into the small of Rust's back. Then the sound. It was thin, weak, a pathetic wet scrape of noise that barely registered over the cooling tick of the motorcycle engine blocks. Rust froze his lighter halfway to his face. "You hear that?" "Hear what?" Cole asked, zipping up and turning around, shivering. "Rats. This whole block is infested." "Not a rat," Wyatt said. He exhaled a thick plume of smoke. The glowing cherry of his cigarette dipped toward the far end of the alley, where a massive green commercial dumpster sat overflowing with black plastic bags and shattered pallets. Rust dropped his unlit cigarette. He didn't want to walk over there. Every instinct cultivated over 15 years in the club screamed at him to get on his bike and ride. You don't look into dark spaces when you have active warrants and an unregistered firearm. You keep your head down. But the sound came again. It wasn't a squeak. It was a cry. Ragged, desperate, human. He moved toward the dumpster, his heavy boots crunching over broken glass. The smell hit him first, a physical wall of stench. Rotting onions, wet cardboard, and the coppery, sickening odor of spoiled meat. He pulled his leather collar over his nose, his eyes watering. "Leave it, man," Cole called out from the bikes. "Probably a crackhead's dog." Rust ignored him. He reached the edge of the dumpster. The metal was freezing under his bare hands. He hoisted himself up, leaning over the rim. It was pitch black inside a chaotic landscape of garbage. He pulled a heavy steel flashlight from his belt and clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through the dark, illuminating greasy pizza boxes, coffee grounds, and a mountain of industrial trash. The sound grew frantic. He tracked it, down toward the bottom left corner beneath a layer of sodden newspapers and an empty bleach bottle. "Shit," Rust whispered. He didn't want to touch the garbage. He hated filth. But he reached down his leather-clad arm, plunging into the rotting mess, and grabbed the corner of a dark, heavy mass. It was a garbage bag tied loosely at the top. He yanked it upward. The plastic tore. Something spilled out onto a pile of damp cardboard. Rust stumbled back, hitting the brick wall of the alley, his flashlight beam trembling. Wyatt was beside him a second later, grabbing the flashlight to steady it. It was a baby. Not a clean pink hospital room baby. This was a raw, terrifying reality. The infant was tiny, its skin a mottled, horrifying shade of blue-gray like bruised fruit. It was smeared with something dark and slick blood and afterbirth and wrapped haphazardly in a stained, threadbare motel towel. Its eyes were squeezed shut, its tiny chest heaving with unnatural, jerky gasps. Jesus Christ! Wyatt breathed the cigarette falling from his lips. Cole walked up behind them. He didn't say a word. He just stared. "Don't touch it," Rust said, his voice rising in an unnatural panic. He backed away. "We don't touch it," We call the cops anonymously from a payphone. We ride. I got a gun. You got a pound of speed in your saddlebag, Cole. We cannot be here." Rust's reaction wasn't heroic. It was survival. He looked at the fragile dying thing in the trash and saw only a cage. He saw police sirens, interrogations, and prison time. Wyatt didn't move. He kept the flashlight pinned on the baby. The infant's mouth opened in a silent scream, a bubble of mucus popping on its blue lips. It was freezing to death. "We leave it's dead in 10 minutes, Wyatt said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of its usual arrogant swagger. "Not our problem," Rust barked, pacing the narrow alley, his hands pulling at his own hair. "People throw things away. That's the world. We don't fix the world, Wyatt. We survive it." Wyatt turned to Rust. The older biker's eyes were utterly dead, hollowed out by a lifetime of seeing the worst of humanity, but there was a frightening stillness in them now. "I ain't leaving a kid to die in the trash, Rust." Without waiting for an answer, Wyatt reached into the dumpster. He didn't hesitate at the slime or the smell. His large, calloused hands stained with engine oil and dirt scooped beneath the bloody towel. He pulled the infant to his chest. The baby was so small it barely covered Wyatt's club patch. The contrast was absurd, the grim, grinning death's head of the Hells Angels logo serving as a resting place for a discarded newborn. Wyatt unzipped his heavy leather jacket. He tucked the baby inside against the thin cotton of his t-shirt, pressing the freezing little body against his own radiating body heat. He zipped the jacket back up, leaving just the top open for air. "Cole," Wyatt said, his voice a low command. "Get my bike started. Rust, you ride point. We're going to the clubhouse." Rust stared at him, enraged and terrified. "You're bringing a bleeding baby to the clubhouse. Are you out of your mind? The cops—" "We'll deal with the cops when the kid isn't blue," Wyatt snapped. "Ride." The ride back was an agonizing blur of sensory overload. Rust rode in front, pushing his bike to 80 miles an hour on the wet surface streets, praying the tires would grip. In his mirrors, he watched Wyatt. The man was riding rigid, his posture unnatural. You don't ride a chopper stiff. You lean with it, you flow with the vibration. But Wyatt was sitting bolt upright, taking the jarring impacts of the potholes directly into his spine to keep his chest still. They hit the dirt road leading to the compound. The clubhouse was an old reinforced concrete structure out by the reservoir, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Dozens of bikes were lined up outside. The heavy thumping bass of southern rock leaked through the walls, mixing with the raucous shouts of a Saturday night run. Rust killed his engine. Wyatt coasted to a stop beside him, struggling to put the kickstand down with one hand. Cole pulled up a moment later. They didn't speak. Wyatt swung his leg over the bike, his hand clutching his chest. Rust walked ahead, pushing the heavy steel door of the clubhouse open. The heat inside was overwhelming, thick with the smell of cheap draft beer, stale cigarette smoke, and frying grease. The main room was packed. About 30 patched members and a dozen women were drinking shooting pool and yelling over the music. Rust walked straight to the jukebox and yanked the power cord from the wall. The music died with a violent scratch. The sudden silence was deafening. Heads turned. Pool cues stopped mid-stroke. Hands dropped toward waistbands out of sheer reflex. The air instantly thickened with violence. "What the hell is your problem, Rust-D?" A massive bearded man at the bar growled. It was Bear, the sergeant-at-arms. Wyatt walked through the door. He looked pale, his leather jacket bulging awkwardly at the chest. He ignored Bear. He scanned the room until he found Brenda. Brenda was 50, tough as old leather, with dyed black hair and a permanent scowl. She was the chapter secretary, the woman who kept the books clean, and the bail bondsman on speed dial. She had raised 3 kids while her husband did a dime in San Quentin. "Brenda," Wyatt said. His voice cracked. He unzipped his jacket. The collective breath of 30 hardened criminals hitched. Wyatt pulled the bundle out. The towel was soaked through with a mixture of dark blood and alley water. He held it out like an offering. For a second, nobody moved. The bikers just stared, massive men covered in ink and scars, paralyzed by the sight of something so overwhelmingly fragile. Brenda broke the spell. She dropped her beer. The glass shattered on the concrete floor. She crossed the room in 3 strides, shoving past Bear, and took the bundle from Wyatt's shaking hands. "Clear the back table," she screamed. It wasn't a request. It was an explosion. The pool table was cleared in seconds, balls scattering, beer bottles knocked to the floor. Brenda laid the baby on the green felt. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead illuminated the grim reality. The baby was barely breathing. "Get me clean towels, hot water, not boiling warm. Get me a bulb syringe from the first aid kit. Move." The clubhouse erupted into panicked chaos. These were men who could strip an engine block in an hour and break a man's femurs without breaking a sweat, but now they were tripping over each other. Bear sprinted to the kitchen. Cole was tearing through the massive metal first aid box on the wall. Rust stood near the doorway, leaning against the cold block wall. He couldn't look at the pool table. He looked at his own hands. They were covered in grease dirt and dried blood from the fight earlier. He felt violently sick. This was no place for a child. This was a den of wolves. "It's a boy." Brenda's voice cut through the noise. She was working fast, wiping the foul-smelling slime from the baby's skin with warm, wet rags. "He's freezing. His core temp is gone." She looked up at the circle of massive men hovering around the table. "You all are radiating heat. Put your hands near him. Don't touch him. Your hands are filthy. Just hover." It was a ridiculous sight. 6 Hell's Angels men, feared across the West Coast, formed a tight circle around the pool table, holding their large tattooed hands inches above the tiny, shivering body, creating a makeshift incubator of body heat. Wyatt stood closest. "Is he going to make it, Bren?" "I don't know," she muttered, using the bulb syringe to suck dark fluid from the baby's tiny nostrils. The infant gasped, arched its back, and finally let out a loud, piercing, sustained wail. The sound bounced off the concrete walls. It was loud, demanding, and full of sudden, furious life. A collective sigh ripped through the room. Bear ran a hand over his face. Wyatt closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping. Rust pushed off the wall, a strange, tight knot in his chest, loosening just a fraction. "We got to call the cops, Brenda," Rust said, walking closer. "Anonymously. They need to get him to a hospital." Brenda looked at the baby, who was now pinking up, wrapped tightly in 3 clean flannel shirts resting on the green felt. She looked at Wyatt, whose leather jacket was stained with blood. Then she looked at Rust. "If we hand him to the state tonight, he goes into the system." Brenda said, her voice low. "I grew up in the system, Rust. It's a meat grinder. They'll put him in a holding ward, then a foster home that only wants the state check." "We are an outlaw motorcycle club," Rust snapped, gesturing around the room. "We got guns, drugs, and God knows what else in this building right now. We aren't exactly a goddamn nursery." "I have a clean record," Brenda said quietly. "No felonies. I own my house. I got an empty spare room." The room went dead silent again. The implications were massive. "You're crazy," Russ said, though his voice lacked its earlier venom. "You take him, the club is tied to him. We bring a kid into this life." Wyatt looked down at the screaming infant. "He was in a dumpster, Rust. He was already in the dirt. We just pulled him out." He reached out, ignoring Brenda's earlier command, and let the baby's tiny hand wrap around his thick, calloused index finger. "His name is Leo." 15 years is a long time for a secret to stay buried, especially in a world built on lies, leverage, and violence. Leo grew up in a contradiction. Legally, he was the foster son, and eventually the adopted son of Brenda Harris. He had a clean bed, hot meals, and went to public school. But practically, he was raised by a village of felons. His childhood was a collage of extreme sensory details. The smell of burning rubber and 10W40 oil was his baseline. His lullabies were the thunderous roar of straight pipes and the heavy rhythmic thud of hard rock. He learned to do fractions by counting the inventory of illicit cigarette cartons in the back room. He learned how to throw a proper left hook from Bear by the time he was 8, and he learned how to strip a carburetor blindfolded from Wyatt by the time he was 12. He didn't view them as heroes. Leo wasn't stupid. By the time he hit his early teens, the romanticized veneer of the outlaw life had worn thin. He saw the reality. He saw Wyatt come home with a stab wound in his thigh, bleeding out on Brenda's kitchen floor while they waited for a mob doctor. He saw the paranoia that gripped the clubhouse when the ATF raided a neighboring chapter. He knew what rust kept in the floorboards. Leo, at 15, was a solitary, observant kid. He had messy, dark hair, a sharp jawline, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was quiet, carrying a cynical armor that made him seem much older. He wore faded denim and boots, but he kept his distance from club business. He loved them. They were his father's, his uncle's, his blood. But he hated the fear that always lingered beneath the surface of their swagger. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, days before his 16th birthday. Leo was in the clubhouse garage, sitting on an overturned milk crate, working a greasy rag over the spokes of Rust's front wheel. Rust walked in. The years had not been kind to him. The gray in his beard was taking over, and he walked with a slight limp from a bike wreck 3 years prior. He held a cup of black coffee in one hand and a small, heavy metal lockbox in the other. He stood watching Leo for a moment. The boy's hands moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. "You missed a spot on the caliper," Russ said, his voice a dry rasp. Leo didn't look up. He shifted the rag and wiped down the brake caliper. "You're burning oil. Blue smoke when you idled in. Rings are going bad." Russ chuckled a sound like grinding stones. He walked over and set the lockbox on the wooden workbench. The heavy thud drew Leo's attention. "What's that?" Leo asked, tossing the rag onto a pile of sawdust. Rust stared at the box. He took a sip of his coffee. His hands, permanently stained and scarred, trembled just a fraction. 15 years ago we found you. You know the story." "Yeah," Leo said, his tone flat. "Dumpster, raining. Wyatt played hero. You tried to run." Leo didn't say it with malice. It was just the truth. Rust had never hidden his initial cowardice. In a twisted way, it was his way of being honest with the kid. "Yeah, I tried to run," Rust agreed, leaning against the workbench. "I was a selfish prick. Still am. But there's a part of the story we didn't tell you. We told you there was nothing else in that dumpster. Just you and a towel." Leo stood up. The casual demeanor dropped instantly. His chest tightened. For 15 years he had lived with the gnawing, empty void of his origins. Who throws away a child, a junkie, a scared teenager? He had built a wall over that void, but Rust's words were a sledgehammer. "What do you mean?" Leo asked, his voice dropping an octave. Rust reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key. He slid it across the workbench. "Wyatt pulled you out. But before we rode off, I looked back in. I saw something shining under the flashlight beam, tangled in the bottom of that bloody towel. I took it. Didn't tell the cops when we finally filed the found child report. Didn't tell anyone but Brenda and Wyatt." Leo stared at the key. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea. He didn't want to open it. Part of him wanted to sweep the box into the trash, to burn it, to keep the void empty. An empty void is painless. Answers bring pain. But his hand moved on its own. He picked up the key. The brass was warm from Rust's pocket. He stepped to the workbench. He slid the key into the lockbox. It turned with a sharp, heavy click. Leo lifted the lid. The hinges groaned softly. Inside, resting on a bed of dry, yellowed foam, were 2 items. The first was a heavy, solid gold signet ring. It wasn't cheap pawnshop jewelry. It was old money, heavy, custom-cast gold. On the flat face of the ring, a crest was deeply engraved, a stylized eagle gripping a fractured sword surrounded by Latin text. The second item was a hospital wristband, but it wasn't cut or broken. It was intact, as if it had slipped off a very thin wrist. It was stained brown with old blood. Leo picked up the wristband with trembling, grease-stained fingers. He held it up to the harsh garage light. The ink was faded, but the typed letters were still legible. Patient name, Sterling C.D.O.B., November 12, 2011. Admitting physician, Dr. Eris Thorne. Leo frowned, his brow furrowing. He dropped the wristband and picked up the heavy gold ring. It felt unnaturally cold in his palm. He turned it over. Engraved on the inside band in tiny, elegant script were 3 words: "Property of Vanguard." "Rust!" Leo whispered, his voice cracking, the grease on his hands smearing against the pristine gold. "What is this?" Rust looked at the boy, his eyes heavy with a decade and a half of dread. "Vanguard isn't a family name, Leo. It's a private military contractor, the guys who handle off-the-book security for politicians and billionaires. And that crest on the ring, that's the seal of the governor's family." The silence in the garage was absolute, broken only by the distant muffled sound of a motorcycle engine revving out on the highway. Leo looked down at the ring, the heavy gold suddenly feeling like an anchor tied to his throat. He wasn't the discarded trash of a street junkie. He was a loose end, a ghost, and the men who threw him away were the men who ran the state. Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof of the garage, a deafening, relentless drumbeat that swallowed the heavy silence between the boy and the aging biker. Leo stood motionless. The gold ring in his palm felt distinctly wrong. It was too dense, too polished, completely alien in a room coated with aerosol brake cleaner and decades of dried sweat. This wasn't a family heirloom passed down with love. It was a brand. He looked at Rust. The older man was staring into his coffee cup like he was trying to read his own obituary in the black liquid. "You kept this for 15 years, Leo said. His voice didn't rise. It fractured. The betrayal wasn't a sharp stab. It was a slow, sickening twist in his gut. "You let me think I was junk. You think knowing you were a hit job is better." Rust fired back, his own guilt warping instantly into defensiveness. He slammed the mug onto the workbench. Coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the wood. "You think having a name attached to a bullet is a comfort, kid. Vanguard doesn't leave loose ends. If they dumped you in a trash compactor on a rainy night, they meant for you to be erased. We gave you a life. We gave you breath." Leo's grip tightened around the ring. The sharp edges of the engraved crest bit into his calloused flesh. He wanted to scream. He wanted to pick up the heavy steel wrench resting on the table and smash it into the cinderblock wall until his arms went numb. Instead, a cold, terrifying calm washed over him. It was a defense mechanism he'd learned from watching these men. When the sirens flash, you don't panic. You lock it down. "Who else knows?" Leo asked, his eyes narrowing. Heavy bootsteps crunched on the gravel outside, followed by the squeal of the rusted metal door sliding open. Wyatt stepped into the garage. He was soaked, his leather cut dripping water onto the concrete floor. The smell of wet dog and stale tobacco rolled in with him. He took one look at the open lockbox, the gold ring in Leo's hand, and Rust's rigid posture. Wyatt didn't yell. His jaw just set, the muscles twitching beneath his graying beard. He walked over to Rust, grabbed him by the collar of his denim jacket, and slammed him backward against the tool pegboard. Wrenches and ratchets clattered to the floor in a metallic rain. "I told you that box goes in the incinerator." Wyatt hissed, his forearm pressed hard against Rust's windpipe. Rust didn't fight back. He just choked out a wet laugh. He had a right to know, brother. He ain't a puppy we rescued from the pound anymore. He's a man, and that ring is a ticking clock. Stop it. Leo shoved himself between the two massive men, planting his hands on Wyatt's chest and pushing with all his meager leverage. Wyatt relented, stepping back, his chest heaving. Leo held the ring up right in Wyatt's face. "The governor's seal. A private army. You knew I wasn't just some crack whore's mistake." Wyatt wiped rain from his face. The violent energy drained out of him, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "We didn't know the exact names at first, Leo. We just knew the crest meant money and the cut wristband meant a cover-up. By the time we figured out it was Governor Caldwell's bloodline, you were 3 years old. You were riding on my gas tank. You were eating at Brenda's table." Wyatt reached out, his thick, scarred fingers hovering over Leo's shoulder before dropping awkwardly to his side. "Caldwell was a state senator back then, a ruthless son of a bitch building an empire. If I made a phone call, if I tried to blackmail them or hand you over, they wouldn't have written a check. They would have sent an eradication team. The club would be ashes. You would be dead. We buried the truth to keep you breathing." "So my mother," Leo's voice finally cracked, the cynical armor dissolving, A raw, terrifying vulnerability leaked out. Who was she? We don't know, Wyatt lied. Leo caught the micro-expression, the slight avert of the eyes, the tightening of the lips. Growing up in a room full of outlaws makes you a polygraph machine. You're lying, Leo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He stepped back, putting distance between himself and the men who raised him. The garage suddenly felt claustrophobic. The smell of oil was suffocating. You know exactly who she was. Wyatt looked at Rust, a silent, grim conversation passing between them. Rust nodded slowly. Her name was Cassidy. Wyatt said the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. She was a college student, volunteered for Caldwell's first gubernatorial campaign. 2 weeks after we found you, the local news ran a story. A tragic suicide. Cassidy drove her sedan off the old quarry bridge, burned to a husk. Leo felt his knees turn to water. He gripped the edge of the workbench to keep from collapsing. The sensory details of the room blurred the hum of the fluorescent light, the damp chill, the harsh glare of the metal tools. He pictured a young woman terrified, giving birth in a sterile room, only to have her child ripped away by men in dark suits. And then a bridge. Fire. Silence. They killed her, Leo breathed. The realization wasn't a shock. It was a cold, absolute certainty. Yes, Wyatt said softly. They did. And if you go digging, they'll kill you too. Throw that ring in the reservoir, Leo. It's poison. Leo looked down at the gold. The eagle on the crest seemed to mock him. He closed his fist around it, sliding it deep into his pocket. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out into the freezing rain, leaving Wyatt and Russ standing in the shadows of the garage. He wasn't going to throw it away. He was going to use it to burn their world down. Information in the outlaw world didn't come from sterile libraries or Google searches. It was traded in cash leverage and whispered favors in the back booths of decaying strip clubs. 3 days had passed. The rain hadn't stopped turning the compound's dirt driveway into a thick, churning mud pit. Leo hadn't spoken to Wyatt or Rust since the garage. He spent his days in a hyper-focused trance, methodically tearing down a motorcycle engine just to keep his hands moving. But his mind was hundreds of miles away, locked inside the high-security gates of the governor's mansion. He needed a thread to pull, and he knew exactly who to tug on. Hutch lived in a rusted-out Airstream trailer behind a pawn shop on the edge of town. 10 years ago, he was a Metro desk reporter with a Pulitzer nomination. Today, he was a functioning alcoholic who did off-the-books background checks for the club in exchange for a steady supply of prescription painkillers and cheap bourbon. Leo kicked the Airstream's door twice. It swung open, revealing a wall of stale cigarette smoke and the sour reek of unwashed clothes. Hutch was slumped at a tiny Formica table, a glowing laptop illuminating his bloodshot eyes. "Kid," Hutch mumbled, squinting. "Tell Bear the title washing on those stolen Indians is done. I need my envelope." Leo stepped inside, shutting the door against the damp wind. He didn't relay the message. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed the heavy gold ring on the table, right on top of a stack of past-due eviction notices. Hutch stopped typing. He stared at the gold. The hazy fog of alcohol in his eyes seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sharp, sudden terror. He didn't touch it. He pulled his hands back into his lap like the ring was radioactive. "Where did you get that?" Hutch's voice was a dry croak. "Found it," Leo lied effortlessly. His face was a mask of cold stone. "I need to know about the Vanguard connection to Governor Caldwell, specifically 15 years ago, around November." Hutch let out a breathless, wheezing laugh. He rubbed his face, his hands trembling violently. "You don't want to know about this, Leo. You really, really don't. This isn't rival gang territory. This isn't stealing cargo. This is the machine. The machine eats people." "Tell me," Leo demanded, leaning over the table. The smell of Hutch's gin-soaked breath was nauseating, but Leo didn't flinch. Hutch looked at the boy. He saw the grim determination, the hard edge that 15 years with the Hells Angels had forged. With a heavy sigh, Hutch opened a secured, encrypted drive on his laptop. 15 years ago, Caldwell was staring down a primary race. Hutch began, his fingers moving rapidly over the keys. He was running on a family values platform, the picture of conservative purity, but he had a habit of picking up young volunteers. One of them, a girl named Cassidy, got pregnant. Leo's chest tightened. Hearing the name spoken out loud by an outsider made it violently real. Caldwell panicked. Hutch continued pulling up archived, redacted police files. He couldn't afford an abortion paper trail and he couldn't afford a bastard, so he utilized Vanguard. They were technically a private security firm on state payroll, but they acted as his personal fixers. The rumor, never proven because the people who tried ended up dead, was that Vanguard took the girl to a private clinic. Induced labor. Hutch pointed to a blurry photograph on the screen. It was a man in a tactical suit, his face obscured by a cap. This is Thomas Reed, Vanguard's chief operator back then. The whisper on the dark web was that Reed was supposed to dispose of the infant, throw it in the river, bury it in the desert. But Reed was fresh off a tour in Fallujah. Maybe he had a moment of PTSD. Maybe he couldn't look a breathing baby in the eye and pull the trigger. So, he compromised. He dumped the kid in a trash bin in the bad part of town, assuming exposure would do the work for him, keeping his hands clean. Leo swallowed hard. The metallic tang of adrenaline flooded his mouth. A hitman with a sliver of conscience. That was the only reason his heart was currently beating. And Cassidy, Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 weeks later, her car went off the quarry bridge, Hutch said grimly. Ruled a suicide due to severe postpartum depression following a supposed miscarriage. Very neat, very clean. Hutch slammed the laptop shut. He looked terrified. Leo, listen to me. I don't know why you're looking into this. If you found that ring on a dead body or in some stolen safe, bury it. Vanguard operates locally now. They run Caldwell's statewide security detail. They have facial recognition software, wiretaps, and badges that give them total immunity. If they catch wind that someone is sniffing around a 15-year-old botched hit, Leo snatched the ring off the table. Thanks, Hutch. He walked out of the trailer before the journalist could say another word. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised, menacing purple. Leo walked back toward his motorcycle, his mind racing. He felt a toxic mixture of profound grief and explosive rage. He wanted Caldwell to hurt. He wanted to watch Vanguard burn to the ground. He straddled his bike, turning the ignition key. The engine roared to life, vibrating up through his boots. As he pulled out of the pawn shop parking lot, he didn't notice the vehicle parked across the 4-lane avenue. It was a matte black Chevrolet Tahoe, heavy window tint, no front license plate. Inside the SUV, a man in a tailored charcoal suit held a directional microphone pointed directly at Hutch's Airstream. The green lights on his audio receiver pulsed rhythmically. The man pressed an earpiece deeper into his ear, listening to the playback of Hutch and Leo's conversation. The man tapped a button on his dashboard radio. Command, this is Echo 4. We have a positive ping on the Vanguard keyword. Audio confirms a local biker associate inquiring about the Cassidy file. Static crackled briefly before a cold, synthesized voice replied, Copy Echo 4, identify the associate. The man in the suit lifted a high-powered digital camera, snapping rapidly as Leo merged onto the highway. The camera's facial recognition software engaged instantly, boxing Leo's face in yellow brackets. A moment later, a name populated on the screen. Leo Harris. Adopted son of Brenda Harris, known associate Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The man smiled, a thin, humorless line. Target identified. He's just a kid. But he's wearing club colors. Understood, Echo 4. Initiate containment protocol. Erase the journalist, then sanitize the motorcycle club. Leave no loose ends this time. Copy that, the man said. He reached into the passenger seat, picking up a suppressed submachine gun. He put the SUV in gear, pulling out into traffic to follow the taillights of Leo's bike. 15 years ago, the wolves had saved Leo from the darkness. Now, because of his own blood, the darkness was coming to slaughter the wolves. Glass shattered before Hutch could even reach for his second glass of gin. His Airstream's cheap aluminum door didn't just swing open, it buckled inward, torn off its hinges by a heavy matte black boot. Hutch scrambled backward, his chair tipping over. He hit the linoleum floor hard, his elbow colliding with the edge of the stove. He didn't scream. Fear had paralyzed his vocal cords. A man stepped through the ruined doorway. He wore no tactical gear, just a charcoal suit perfectly tailored to a wide, muscular frame. A heavy silencer was threaded onto the barrel of the pistol in his right hand. The weapon rose with terrifying mechanical precision. Hutch's trembling hand blindly slapped the top of his desk, searching for the heavy brass paperweight he kept there, or maybe his phone. Wait, I didn't send it anywhere. The gun cycled. It didn't sound like the movies. It sounded like a thick, dry tree branch snapping, followed instantly by the wet, sickening thud of the bullet striking Hutch's chest. Hutch gasped, staring down at his ruined shirt. He slumped against the cheap faux wood paneling, his breath rattling in his throat, a bright crimson stain spreading across the eviction notices scattered on the floor. The man in the suit stepped forward, his expression completely blank, and fired a second round into Hutch's forehead. The assassin didn't check the pulse. He simply turned his attention to the laptop on the table. He pulled a small incendiary drive from his pocket, jammed it into the USB port, and walked out into the damp night. Behind him, the hard drive began to spark and melt, thick white smoke filling the tiny trailer with the acrid smell of burning plastic. Miles away, Leo leaned into a sharp curve, his knee hovering inches above the wet asphalt. The cold wind tore at his jacket, biting into the exposed skin of his neck. He felt a toxic, buzzing energy humming through his veins. He finally knew the truth. He wasn't a mistake. He was a liability, a loose end belonging to the most powerful man in the state. For 15 years, he had felt like an imposter among outlaws. Now, he felt dangerous. He kicked his bike into a higher gear, the engine screaming. But the illusion of power didn't last. As he turned onto the long gravel road leading to the clubhouse, his burner phone buzzed violently in his inner pocket. He ignored it for a quarter mile, but the buzzing didn't stop. It was a frantic, continuous vibration. Leo hit the brakes, the rear tire skidding slightly in the wet gravel. He killed the engine, balancing the heavy bike between his thighs, and pulled the phone out. It wasn't a call. It was a rapid-fire string of automated texts from Hutch's emergency deadman switch, a script the paranoid journalist had set up years ago, triggered if his heart monitor watch dropped to 0. Hutch_vital_fail. Last audio clip attached, burn everything. Leo stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. His thumb hovered over the audio file. He pressed play. The audio was incredibly clear. He heard Hutch's chair scrape. He heard the door buckle. He heard Hutch's panicked, pleading voice, and then the sharp crack of the suppressed pistol. The breath rushed out of Leo's lungs. The buzzing energy evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy block of absolute dread. The Vanguard operator hadn't just followed Hutch. They had followed Leo. They had listened. Leo dropped the phone into his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the bike. He slammed his boot down on the Kickstarter. The engine roared, and he tore down the gravel road, spitting rocks in his wake. He didn't park in the lot. He drove the motorcycle straight up the wooden ramp and crashed through the heavy double doors of the clubhouse, tearing the metal hinges loose. The loud crash sent the main room into immediate violent motion. Pool cues dropped, knives flashed. Bear leaped over the bar, a heavy tire iron in his fist. Leo killed the engine, the smell of burning rubber and exhaust filling the room. He stumbled off the bike, pale and hyperventilating. "They're coming!" Leo choked out, his voice cracking. "Vanguard! They killed Hutch! They know I know!" Wyatt was sitting at a poker table in the corner, counting a stack of grimy 20s. He froze. The bills slipped from his fingers, scattering across the green felt. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand proof. He looked at the absolute terror on the boy's face and knew the 15-year clock had just run out. "Bear!" Wyatt roared, kicking his chair back. "Kill the mains! Shut down the generators! Get the heavy steel on the windows!" "What's happening?" Brenda shouted, emerging from the back office, a ledger in her hand. "Oh." "War," Rust said flatly. He was already moving. He limped rapidly to the floorboards beneath the jukebox, prying up a loose plank with a hunting knife. He pulled out a heavy canvas duffel bag smelling strongly of gun oil and mildew. He threw it onto the nearest pool table and unzipped it, revealing a terrifying arsenal of unregistered sawed-off shotguns, AR-15s, and boxes of hollow-point ammunition. "Arm up!" Rust barked, tossing a heavy Remington pump-action to Bear. "Nobody comes through those doors with a pulse. Nobody!" The clubhouse descended into chaotic, practiced preparation. The bikers moved like a hive disturbed. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows, the rusty bolts shrieking as Bear slammed them home. The overhead fluorescent lights died instantly as someone cut the main breaker. The massive room was plunged into near-total darkness, lit only by the dim orange glow of emergency exit signs and the sweeping beams of heavy tactical flashlights. Leo stood frozen by his motorcycle. He had grown up watching these men brawl, seeing them break jaws over bad drug deals or bruised egos. But this wasn't a bar fight. The metallic clacking of bolts racking and magazine seating was a chilling, sterile sound. Wyatt walked over to Leo. He held out a heavy blued steel Colt M1911. Leo stared at the gun. His stomach churned. "I don't know how to shoot that under pressure. I'll hit one of you." "You take it," Wyatt ordered, grabbing Leo's wrist and shoving the heavy weapon into his palm. The metal was freezing. "You don't aim. You point at the door, and if a man in a suit steps through, you pull the trigger until it clicks empty. Then, you run for the tunnel behind the boiler." "I brought them here," Leo whispered, the guilt tearing at his throat. "I should have left the ring in the dirt." "You didn't bring them here?" Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. "They threw you in a dumpster, kid. We just picked you up. This fight was always going to happen." A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the compound. The rain had stopped. Outside, the crickets were dead quiet. There was no sound of approaching sirens, no screeching tires, just the sickeningly quiet crunch of gravel. "They have night vision," Bear whispered from the shadows near the front entrance, peering through a small slit in the steel shutters. 3 dark SUVs, no headlights, about a dozen guys stacking up, full tactical gear, suppressed carbines. "Spread out," Rust yelled from behind the overturned heavy oak bar. "Crossfire arcs." Then the front wall exploded. They didn't bother with the doors. A shaped breaching charge blew a 10-foot hole straight through the cinderblock wall of the clubhouse. The shockwave hit Leo like a physical punch to the chest. The deafening concussive crack ruptured his eardrums, leaving behind a shrill, piercing ring that drowned out everything else. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized concrete and gray dust filled the room instantly. 2 metallic cylinders bounced across the linoleum floor. Flashbangs. "Eyes down!" Wyatt screamed, tackling Leo to the ground just as the grenades detonated. Brilliant, blinding white light strobed through the dust, accompanied by another set of concussive blasts. The smell was horrific, a toxic blend of burning magnesium sulfur and ancient dust. Before the light faded, Vanguard moved in. They were shadows, moving with terrifying, synchronized efficiency. No shouting, no hesitation, just the soft, rapid f-f of suppressed automatic weapons tearing through the air. Wood splintered. Bottles behind the bar exploded into a shower of glass and cheap whiskey. Bear roared a primal animal sound of pure rage and leaned out from behind a steel pillar. He racked his shotgun and fired. The boom of the unsuppressed 12-gauge was deafening. The heavy buckshot caught the lead Vanguard operator in the chest. The man's ceramic body armor took the brunt of the impact, but the kinetic force lifted his 200-pound frame off the ground and threw him backward into the rubble. "Got one!" Bear yelled, pumping the action. A tight 3-round burst from a Vanguard carbine answered him. The bullets tore through the drywall pillar. One caught Bear in the meat of his left shoulder. He spun, dropping the shotgun blood spraying across the felt of the pool table. "Bear!" Brenda screamed from the back hallway. She leaned around the corner blindly, firing a heavy revolver into the dust cloud. The muzzle flashes lit up the room in brief, terrifying snapshots of chaos. Leo lay flat on his stomach behind the overturned poker table. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard it hurt. He squeezed his eyes shut, coughing violently on the concrete dust. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The gun in his hand felt like a lead weight. He wasn't a soldier. He was a teenager who knew how to rebuild carburetors. "Shoot, kid." Rust bellowed from somewhere to Leo's right. Rust was firing an AR-15 in short controlled bursts, his face illuminated by the flashes completely devoid of fear. He looked almost relieved, as if 15 years of waiting for the axe to fall had finally ended. A Vanguard operator flanked to the left, stepping quietly through the smoke, his rifle raised toward Rust's blind side. Leo opened his eyes. He saw the laser sight from the operator's rifle cut through the dust painting, a green dot directly on Rust's leather vest. Rust! Leo screamed, his vocal cords tearing. Leo raised the Colt 1911. He didn't check his stance. He didn't breathe out. He just pointed the heavy barrel at the dark shape in the smoke and yanked the trigger. The gun bucked violently in his grip, the recoil sending pain shooting up his wrist. The bullet missed the operator entirely, shattering a neon beer sign on the wall behind him. But the loud, unsuppressed gunshot made the Vanguard soldier flinch. Rust whipped around, saw the operator, and fired twice. The operator collapsed, dropping his rifle. "Fall back!" Wyatt yelled over the din of gunfire. "They're flanking the kitchen into the armory. Move!" Wyatt grabbed Leo by the collar of his denim jacket, hauling him to his feet. They sprinted toward the heavy reinforced steel door at the back of the clubhouse. Bullets snapped the air around them, sounding like angry hornets. Splinters of wood and chunks of plaster rained down on their heads. Bear stumbled through the door, first clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. Brenda pulled him inside. Rust provided covering fire, walking backward, his rifle barking furiously until the bolt locked back on an empty magazine. He threw the empty gun at the encroaching shadows and dove through the doorway. Wyatt slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the massive deadbolts. A second later, a hail of suppressed gunfire hammered against the outside of the door, denting the thick steel but failing to penetrate. The armory was a small, windowless concrete bunker where the club stored its most illicit inventory. It smelled intensely of damp earth cosmoline and old blood. There was a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling, casting long, erratic shadows. Russ slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. He looked at Leo, a grim, bloody smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Nice distraction, kid. Recoil's a bitch, ain't it?" Leo leaned over a crate of ammunition and vomited violently. His stomach heaved, emptying its contents onto the concrete floor, the sour smell of bile mixed with the cordite in the air. He wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling, grease-stained hand. "I can't do this!" Leo gasped, tears of sheer panic cutting tracks through the concrete dust on his face. "They're going to kill us all, because of me!" Wyatt walked over. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer comfort. He grabbed Leo by the shoulders and slammed him back against the cold concrete wall. It wasn't gentle. "Stop it!" Wyatt growled, his face inches from Leo's. "You listen to me. Vanguard doesn't leave survivors. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to sanitize. If we die in this room, we die because we made a choice 15 years ago in that alley, not because of you." A heavy rhythmic thud echoed from the steel door. Clang. Clang. Vanguard was setting up a breaching ram. "Door's not going to hold a shaped charge," Bear wheezed, sliding down the wall, his hand slick with his own blood. "Tunnel's blocked. Rains washed out the exit grate last week. We're boxed in." Brenda was rapidly reloading a revolver, her hands remarkably steady. "So we bleed them before we go." Leo looked at the faces of the people in the room. They were criminals. They sold drugs, broke bones, and lived outside the boundaries of human decency. But they were also the only people who had ever looked into a dumpster and chosen to reach inside. He looked down at his own hand. The heavy gold ring bearing the Caldwell crest was still deep in his pocket. It felt like a burning coal against his thigh. He wasn't a hardened biker, and he wasn't a trained operative. But he had leverage. Wyatt. Leo said, his voice suddenly dropping the panic. It was a cold, dead tone he had never used before. "If I give them what they want, will they let you live?" Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "They don't want the ring, Leo. They want the ghost attached to it. They want you." "I know," Leo said. He stepped away from the wall. He reached for the deadbolt on the steel door. "That's why I'm going out there." Wyatt's hand shot out, thick fingers clamping around Leo's wrist like a vice. He yanked the teenager away from the deadbolt, slamming him against the cinderblock wall so hard, Leo's teeth rattled. "Have you lost your goddamn mind?" Wyatt spit his face, a mask of concrete dust and desperation. "I didn't keep you breathing for 15 years, so you could walk out there and catch a bullet to save my skin." Leo didn't fight back. He slumped against the cold, rough wall. His hands were shaking slick with his own cold sweat, but his voice was unnervingly flat. "They don't want a firefight, Wyatt. They want a clean sweep. Hutch had a dead man switch. I have the audio on my phone. They know I have it. If I die in this room, Vanguard doesn't know where else that file goes." Rust barked a harsh, wet laugh from the corner, clutching his ribs. "You think a private army gives a shit about a bluff kid? They're gonna blow that door off its hinges and shoot you in the face." "Maybe." Leo swallowed hard, the taste of bile and copper sharp on his tongue. "But they're also looking for the Caldwell ring, and I'm going to give it to them." Before Wyatt could tighten his grip, Bear groaned violently from the floor. He tried to shift his weight, but the bullet wound in his shoulder sent a fresh surge of dark arterial blood pooling onto the concrete. Brenda tore a strip of fabric from her shirt, pressing it hard into Bear's torn flesh. "He's bleeding out, Wyatt," Brenda said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "We have 5 minutes before he goes into shock." Another concussive slam rocked the heavy steel door. The thick metal groaned inward, the heavy locking pins straining against the frame. Dust cascaded from the ceiling bulb. They had 2 hits left before the hinges gave way. "Let me go," Leo whispered, his eyes locking onto Wyatt's. It wasn't a heroic plea. It was a terrified, desperate resignation. He was shaking so hard, his knees were knocking together. He didn't want to die. Every instinct in his teenage body screamed at him to hide behind the older men, to let them take the bullets. But he looked at the blood-soaking bear's cut, at the gray in Rust's beard, at the deep, exhausted lines on Wyatt's face. These wolves were dying because they had dragged a lamb into their den. Wyatt stared at the boy. The fierce, unyielding biker finally cracked. His broad shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He let go of Leo's wrist. "You keep your hands up," Wyatt rasped, his voice breaking. "You don't make sudden movements. You hear me?" Leo nodded. He turned to the heavy steel door. His fingers brushed the deadbolt. The metal was freezing. He threw the latch, the heavy thunk echoing loudly in the tiny sealed room. He grabbed the handle and pushed. The door swung outward. Thick, acrid smoke poured into the armory, blinding him for a second. The smell of burning drywall and spent ammunition was a physical weight in his lungs. Red laser sights cut through the gray fog instantly, 4 distinct beams snapping onto Leo's chest, painting his denim jacket with deadly precision. "Hands!" a synthesized mechanical voice barked from the shadows. Leo threw his hands in the air. In his left fist, he held the burner phone. In his right, pinched between his thumb and forefinger, he held the heavy gold Caldwell signet ring. He stepped out into the ruined main room of the clubhouse. The carnage was absolute. Pool tables were splintered into jagged kindling. The jukebox was a smoking crater of plastic and wire. Tactical flashlights cut harsh white cones through the swirling dust. 4 men in heavy black ceramic armor had their suppressed carbines leveled at his head. They were completely silent, their faces hidden behind dark ballistic masks and night vision goggles. A 5th man stepped forward. He wasn't wearing a helmet. He wore a tailored charcoal suit covered in a thin layer of white plaster dust. He held a suppressed pistol aimed casually at Leo's stomach. It was the same man who had shot Hutch. "Ooh, where's the journalist's drive?" the man asked. His voice was calm, utterly devoid of adrenaline. It was the voice of a man asking for the time. "Burned." Leo lied, his voice cracking on the syllable. He cleared his throat, trying to find the cynical edge he had practiced in the garage for years. It failed him. He was just a terrified kid. "He had a dead man switch, audio file. It went to a cloud server and it went to my phone." The man in the suit tilted his head slightly. The red lasers didn't waver from Leo's chest. "A cloud server? That's unfortunate. Hand over the phone." "No," Leo said, his arm trembling violently as he held up the gold ring. The dull yellow metal caught the harsh glare of the tactical lights. "You want this, and you want me gone. I know who I am. I know about Cassidy. I know about the dumpster. The man in the suit stopped walking, his eyes narrowed, fixing on the ring, and then slowly drifting up to Leo's face. For the first time, a flicker of something human crossed the assassin's perfectly still features. Recognition. "Your vanguard!" Leo choked out, desperately trying to keep his composure. Hutch said a guy named Thomas Reed ran the detail back then, the guy who couldn't pull the trigger on a newborn. The silence in the ruined clubhouse was deafening, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured gas line somewhere behind the bar. "Thomas Reed is dead," the man in the suit said softly. "I am Echo 4, and you are a loose end. If I die here, the audio goes to the state attorney general." Leo lied, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had no idea how Hutch's code worked. He was gambling his life on an empty threat. "You shoot me, Caldwell's DNA is left all over this floor. You think he wants a media circus? A DNA test on a dead kid matching the governor." Echo 4 stared at the boy. He saw the grease under the kid's fingernails, the cheap denim, the absolute terror masking a desperate intelligence. Then, Echo 4 looked past Leo toward the open steel door of the armory where Wyatt stood in the shadows, a heavy Colt 1911 leveled at the assassin's head. "We don't need to kill you, kid," Echo 4 said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We just need you to disappear." Again, Leo swallowed hard, the sharp taste of cordite coating his throat. His arms ached from holding them up. The 4 Vanguard operators behind Echo 4 remained perfectly still, fingers hovering millimeters from their triggers. "I take the ring," Echo 4 said, stepping closer. His perfectly polished black shoes crunched over broken glass. "I take the phone. You and your family never speak the name Caldwell again. You remain ghosts. What's stopping you from killing us anyway?" Leo asked, a tear of sheer stress leaking from the corner of his eye, cutting a clean line through the gray dust on his cheek. Echo 4 reached out his gloved hand, closing over the gold ring in Leo's trembling fingers. He pulled it free with a sharp tug. Then he snatched the burner phone from Leo's other hand. "Because a massacre of 5 Hell's Angels requires a federal investigation," Echo 4 said coldly. "And Caldwell is launching his Presidential Exploratory Committee next week. He doesn't want federal agents digging through bullet casings in a biker bar looking for motives. You are alive right now strictly due to political inconvenience." The assassin pocketed the ring and the phone. He raised 2 fingers. The 4 Vanguard operators instantly lowered their rifles, stepping backward into the shadows of the breached wall. Echo 4 leaned in close to Leo. The man smelled of expensive cologne and gun oil. 15 years ago, someone gave you a chance you didn't deserve. Don't waste it. If I ever see your face on a camera, if I ever hear a whisper of this night, I will come back, and I won't bother talking." Echo 4 turned his back and walked toward the gaping hole in the cinderblock wall. Within seconds, the dark shapes of the Vanguard team melted into the rainy night. The sound of high-powered SUV engines revved in the distance, tearing down the gravel road, fading into nothing. Leo stood frozen in the middle of the ruined room. The adrenaline crashed out of his system in a violent wave. His knees buckled and he collapsed onto the debris-covered linoleum, gasping for air, his chest heaving. Wyatt stepped out of the armory, the heavy Colt lowering to his side. Rust limped out behind him, clutching his ribs, followed by Brenda supporting a barely conscious bear. The clubhouse was utterly destroyed. 15 years of memories, stolen goods, and brotherhood reduced to shredded drywall and splintered wood. The cold wind howled through the breached wall, carrying the smell of wet earth and ozone. Wyatt walked over to where Leo was kneeling on the floor. The massive biker dropped to one knee, ignoring the broken glass digging into his jeans. He reached out with a trembling, grease-stained hand and gripped the back of Leo's neck, pulling the boy's forehead against his own shoulder. "You did good, kid," Wyatt whispered, his voice a ragged scrape. "You did good." Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the lapels of Wyatt's heavy leather vest. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollowed out. He had traded his only connection to his bloodline for his life. Governor Caldwell, the man who had ordered his mother's death. The man who had thrown him away like garbage was going to walk away clean. But as the heavy scent of old leather sweat and cheap beer filled his nose, Leo realized something profound. Blood didn't mean anything. Blood was just biology. Blood was a coward in a mansion. He opened his eyes, looking past Wyatt's shoulder at the ruined clubhouse at Rust, wrapping a bandage around Bear's arm, at Brenda sweeping shattered glass out of the way with her boot. They were criminals. They were violent, deeply flawed, broken people. But they were his. They were the ones who reached into the dark. They took the ring. Leo mumbled against Wyatt's jacket, his voice finally steadying. Wyatt pulled back, looking the boy in the eyes. A grim, exhausted smile cracked through the dirt on the biker's face. Good. We don't need their gold, Leo. We got our own. Wyatt stood up, groaning as his bad back protested. He offered a hand to Leo. Leo looked at the massive, scarred hand. It was the same hand that had pulled a freezing, dying infant out of a wet garbage bag. Leo reached up, grabbing Wyatt's forearm, and let the man pull him to his feet. Rust! Wyatt called out, turning toward the wreckage of the bar. Grab whatever whiskey survived. We got a lot of sweeping to do before the cops show up. Leo wiped his face on his sleeve. The fear was gone. The void of his past was finally closed, sealed shut with violence and terror. He wasn't Vanguard's ghost. He wasn't Caldwell's bastard. He walked over to his motorcycle, righting it from where it had fallen during the blast. He grabbed a greasy rag from his back pocket and began wiping the concrete dust off the chrome. He was Leo Harris, and he was exactly where he belonged. What an intense, blood-pumping conclusion. Leo survived the ghosts of his past by leaning on the only family that ever mattered, the wolves who pulled him from the trash. Do you think Leo made the right call handing over the ring, or should he have found a way to take Caldwell down? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this gritty, raw story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends. And make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next dark, twisted tale.